Hello, everyone. Thank you for those of you who have joined us so far. We will get started here. Let's see, making sure everybody can hear me. I can look through our list here. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon for those of you on the Central and Eastern time zone. And good evening to you if you are listening to this anytime after this at night. We are beyond thrilled and excited that we can have this webinar. It's the first of two. And we are blessed and very excited that we have Dr. Nathan Grawe joining us for this. So this should be a wonderful hour to spend together. If you are joining, this is Future Proofing Enrollment, how the demographic shifts will reshape admissions. This is our first webinar of two, and this one's focusing on the changing face of the college-bound student. Before we get started, and while people still come in, I want to say a big thank you to DegreeSight, who has really been the reason why we're able to do this. And so we're going to actually play a quick video that we've provided while others kind of continue to join us. Then we will jump into introductions, and then we'll have Dr. Grawe come on and share his wisdom and insights with us. So here we go.
We have just seen tremendous growth at Roosevelt.
Our overall transfer deposit number right now is up 30% from where it was this time last year.
With DegreeSight, we've already seen a direct impact. Just 2 students tied to DegreeSight generated over $30,000 in new revenue, easily justifying the investment.
You know, we created some tools to make it public on campus of what our rules are, but we obviously didn't have the scope and reach that DegreeSight does.
It's now about a 2-step process instead of a 5-step process.
Saving time is good. Saving trees and time is even better, right?
Yes.
The customer service at DegreeSight has been outstanding. Anytime I've needed anything, they have been quick to respond to ensure that we keep moving forward. DegreeSight takes the pressure off our admissions and registrar's offices. Once the rules are set, the system does the heavy lifting, reducing oversight and simplifying our processes.
You know, with our transfer students, I think year over year, we are continuing to see more and more and more transfer students come.
Awesome.
Which is terrific.
My colleague as the director of transfer admission was interested, obviously, in the marketing side of it, right? Because what more would a transfer student want or a transfer applicant want than to know what they've already done? How, you know, the question to ask is how long is this going to take? How much is it going to cost me? And, you know, how close am I?
In real time, you can see how I'm reviewing your credits and how our registrar is reviewing your credits. And then you know for certainty that your credits are going to transfer and how they're going to transfer. And there's transparency right off the bat, which I think has really helped our students say, yes, I want to come to Malone. This is where I'm supposed to be. And it's just kind of that final box that's been checked off for them.
All right. Well, before we get started here, I want to remind everybody you are welcome to ask questions in the chat as we go along. We will try to address them, and my team's doing a great job of making sure I take a look at them. A few introductions. I will introduce myself. So I am Drew Melendrez. I'm one of the co-founders here at DegreeSight. I've spent most of my career as a senior VP of enrollment management, both at private institutions, at public institutions. Started my career in admissions at a Big 12 school down in Lubbock, Texas, before they had that kid named Patrick Mahomes. And it was hard to get kids to go to Lubbock, Texas. But spent my most formative years as a VP of enrollment at a 100% adult learner and transfer-focused institution, where our average age student was 32 years old. They brought 2.6 transcripts with them on average, 90 plus credits for review, and we awarded 62 on average. And I just went through all the struggles and pain of what it meant to be a transfer student that couldn't get answers to the questions of tell me how my credits transfer, had registrar and admission staff frustrated because it took so long to do credit evals, that we couldn't get to students in a timely manner, and an admissions team that desperately wanted to do this for prospective students, but our processes just wouldn't allow it. So I met my co-founder, David Cook, a brilliant young man who did not graduate on time because he got some bad advising. And this was a formative thing. And he came to me and said, let's build a tool that shows students how to graduate on time. And I said, I love it. Let's also build a tool that shows them exactly how their credits are going to transfer. And so we are off and running from there. He's built an amazing tool that answers all of the top of mind questions. And we're very blessed and fortunate that we've had so many partner schools continue to join us. When I was a VP of enrollment, one of my favorite things was to only meet with the vendors that taught me something before they tried to sell me something. And we think that being thought leaders in the space and working with people like Dr. Grawe are a real key to making sure that we as a collective group all get smarter. So I will introduce Dr. Grawe. Dr. Grawe is a professor of economics at Carleton College, where he has served on the faculty since 1999. He earned his BA from St. Olaf College and his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He is a labor economist, examines intergenerational connections in education and labor market outcomes. Among other topics, Nathan has written extensively on demographic forces and their connections to higher education demand, including demographics and demand for higher education, and the Agile College, his follow-up book there. So Dr. Grawe, thank you so much for joining us today. I will stop my share and I will give you the opportunity to share on your side. And while you're doing that, I will also say I've been also fortunate. He's been willing to do this and partner with me on a number of occasions, and deeply appreciate you, Dr. Grawe, for being willing to come and do this with us. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for having me, Drew. It's a special privilege to meet with this group for two reasons. As a faculty member, I'm guessing all of you in the enrollment management world recognize that there can be some gap between the academic teaching side of the college and the admissions side. And it's just been a really great adventure this last decade or so to better get to know the work that goes on to give me the ability to do what I love to do in the classroom. The second reason why I like this group is I think Crowe was the first public presentation that I made of this work. So we go back a ways. So thanks so much for having me. And I'm looking forward to talking in this two-part. This is part one, which is going to focus on what's going on demographically, though you'll see at the end I sort of sneak in a little bit of maybe a teaser for what session two will be about, which is how higher ed can respond, because I really want us to think about this while retaining a sense of agency. We're going to see some tough demographic statistics, to be sure, but I think we don't want to look at this as something that's merely being done to us. I saw a news article from the Northeast where someone in admissions said, I have started to view, this was about 8 years ago, I've started to view the mid-2020s as what I term the apocalypse. And I thought, wow, okay, if it's the apocalypse, we just all go home, right? Hang out with people we love. And I want us to think in a slightly more constructive way than that. But admittedly, we're gonna look at some tough data. I'm guessing some of the viewers have seen this data before, but for some, this might be new material. So today in part one, we're just gonna kind of dig in and try to understand the changing face of the college-bound student.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's dive in. I'll tee you up. What are some of the major demographic trends and shifts that will shape our population of young people in the next 2 decades?
Yeah, so there are a couple forces that are all happening at once. So some of these forces have to do with the composition of young people. So on the left here, you see some work done by William Frey at the Brookings Institution. He's looking at census data here and just projecting out when does the country reach the tipping point at which it is no longer majority non-Hispanic white. And for the country as a whole, this takes place mid-century-ish, 2045, I think he estimates. But when we look at younger generations, they are more diverse. And so as a consequence, if we're asking when did the under age 18 population cross this tipping point, that's actually in our rearview mirror. While we were grappling with COVID, we passed that milestone. And we're just on the verge of, in the early 2030s, the year when we're going to see that the traditional college age cohorts are no longer majority non-Hispanic white. So this is the confluence of a number of factors. They're sort of slow moving. So we've got immigration rates, we've got fewer immigrants coming from Europe, say, than from Central America or Asia. At the same time, we've got differences in birth rates. So Hispanics have higher birth rates than whites, for instance. And so these forces are slowly reshaping the country. We also have some slow forces of interstate migration. So young families have been moving out of the Northeast and off the West Coast toward the South and the Southwest. And so on top of this shift in composition by race and ethnicity, we've also got a shift in the composition geographically. And that's sort of hitting the news recently more and more. I see notes about the Atlantic South, so Florida and Georgia, Tennessee, and then the Mountain West, Idaho and Montana and the Dakotas, sort of defying the general demographic pattern. So these kinds of compositional effects are slow moving forces. And we've been grappling with this for a while. So I know that most in the audience, if they've been in higher ed for any amount of time, have seen this on their campuses. The Department of Education provides annual estimates of the share of new students, new undergraduate students who are non-Hispanic white. And as recently as the year 2000, it was more than 70%. But in the last couple of years, we're just above 50%. So we've seen this transformation on our campuses. It's been slow and evolving. We're going to see that it will continue. But there's a second force that's maybe more salient in this year especially, but has been catching a lot of people's eyes, and that has to do with fertility rates. So here we have CDC data on the history of live births in the United States from 1975 through 2024. And you can see that for decades we had more or less an uptrend. And then in 2007, we reached a peak, and we've been on a downward slide since. Now, this isn't just in the United States that we're seeing this. We're seeing this in other developed countries, Japan, but also developing countries, China, South America, Central America. So it's a broad trend that we're seeing as people choose to have fewer children, but we're certainly experiencing it here in the US. So the last year we've got data for is 2024. You can see there that maybe we're finding ourselves a bottom in the last few years, though I'm not entirely sure. It's been almost 20 years now of a downward slide in the number, and we're down by more than 15%. So this is not a small change, and it's also importantly not a 1 year or a 2 year phenomena that you sort of muddle through. Let's just have a few extra students before this happens and a few extra students after it happens, and we'll kind of average it out. Instead, we're going to be grappling with a substantial and persistent change. Not all parts of the country are the same, as we'll see, but we've got a real challenge. Now, the challenge for higher ed is in part compounded by the fact that it adds up over time. At any point in time, we might have between 4 to 6 birth cohorts on campus. We can see the consequences here in work by Kenneth Johnson, who's adding up from the 2007 peak until 2024. What is the aggregate number of foregone or delayed births? So what if, in particular, we had the 2007 fertility rates persist all the way through 2024, well, then we would see what the blue line shows here. And you can see this general increase. If fertility rates, if the propensity to have kids had stayed the same, we would have seen a pretty substantial increase in the number of young people because we had more young women entering into the time of higher fertility. But instead, because women were pulling back from the numbers of children that they chose to have, we actually experienced the red line here. And you can see that the aggregate gap since the peak in 2007 is now almost 12 million kids. So, higher ed in the years, if we think about the traditional age market, we're working at an 18-year lag. So 2007 was the peak number of kids being born. That's 2025, the class we just admitted, the high school class of 2025 is sort of the big high school class. And then from here on, we have, at this point, many years, we don't know how long it will last, of decline. We can push out. We've now got data through births of 2024. So that means we're looking out to the classes that are coming to us, traditional college age students in the age of 2042. And we're looking at, in aggregate, missing about 12 million bodies, of which about 2/3 might have been expected to attend colleges. So this is a real challenge for us.
Yeah. And, I know some of us are already feeling it. We only feel the competition getting harder, but does this affect us all nationally the same, or can you break it down a little bit more for segments of the country?
Yeah, no, certainly not everybody is going to experience it the same way, in part because we see differences geographically in where the kids are being born and where they're moving to. So as I mentioned, we've got these interstate migration patterns. Some states are seeing young families move away from them. Other states are seeing families move to them. And it's sort of at the intersection of these interstate migrations, fertility rates, and to a much lesser degree, immigration. We'll talk about immigration in a little bit more detail, that we get these changes in the numbers of young people. So what I'm presenting here is work done by WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Ed. They've sort of been the leader in projecting the number of high school graduates. So that's what they're projecting here is number of high school graduates, which of course is going to be closely connected to the population head counts. And you can see that they're projecting from the year 2025 to 2041 declines in most parts of the country. You can see that South Atlantic region is a little bit stronger, largely due to influxes of young people from other states, a little bit also due to immigration. Texas stands out. And then we have sort of the mountain west of the Dakotas, Montana, and Idaho. But aside from those exceptions to the rule, we're seeing substantial declines throughout the country. California off by more than a quarter, and New York off by more than a quarter, and Illinois off by about a third. So these are some pretty substantial declines. And when you are thinking about it as a college, obviously, if you're in Illinois, it's a tougher situation than if you're in Florida or Texas. It depends a little bit on, want to be a little bit careful here. Just because I'm in Texas doesn't mean I'm immune, because many institutions do recruit out-of-state students, and you wouldn't be surprised to note that a lot of institutions are looking at this kind of map and saying, okay, so we'd like to relocate some admissions personnel down into Texas. We can see that there are going to be differences geographically. The Northeast has been traditionally kind of ground zero for demographic decline, low fertility, but it's really the Northeast quadrant of the country that's been participating earliest in that demographic decline, whether by outmigration or fertility, and the West Coast is joining in as well. We can also think about different subgroups by race and ethnicity. So this again is the WICHE data, now broken down by the 4 major racial groups of Asian and non-Hispanic OPI, Black, Hispanic, and white. And here you can see by the 4 census regions that the Black and white numbers in particular are expected to be in decline, with the Hispanic and the Asian subgroups doing better, though how much better depends on the area. So for instance, if you're in the Northeast, Asian American population holds up for a few more years before it joins the white and the Black subpopulations in declining numbers of high school graduates, while the Hispanic number continues to grow. Out in the West, we're seeing declines in all 4 subgroups. In the South and Midwest, it looks like we have sort of a 2 and 2 case. So when we think about some institutions, our Hispanic serving institutions, for instance, they have a slightly more auspicious path ahead, because we can see that the Hispanic population in all 4 regions is relatively stronger, and in some regions it's just outright strong. Whereas institutions that have focused in particular on the non-Hispanic white subpopulations have to be thinking about either seeing a declining pool of students because that student is just in decline, or maybe this institution is going to be, contemplating how it can speed up the process that all of us are experiencing, which is this demographic shift that we talked about earlier. Now, there's one complicating factor when we look at this graph here. So this is the 4 major subgroups. What I'm going to do now is just add a little bit of nuance, which has the students who identify as multiracial. So they've got 2 or more races. Traditionally, so we don't know from the WICHE data exactly which 2 races the individual students are identifying as. Traditionally, this has been more common among Asians than it is among Blacks. So a student is more likely to say I'm 2 or more races if they're Asian and Black or Asian and white than say if they were they had parents who were both Black and white. So think about President Obama, for instance. I think identified himself as the first African-American president. I think most of us thought of him very comfortably in that way, but technically he could have identified as 2 or more races. So when we bring this 2 or more race category in, we can see that while that group is small, it's expected to be growing in all 4 regions of the country. We've got more and more young people who probably both are the product of parents of multiple races, but also maybe critically important, are identifying that way. They identify their race in a more complicated and nuanced way. And so some of the decline in the numbers of African American and especially Asian young people is accounted for those by those same bodies that in the past might have identified as, say, Asian, now identify as 2 or more races. So I wanted to add that just to bring in kind of the full complexity of the picture, that racial identity is, of course, complicated, and we're seeing some shifts in the way people identify. I think this really stems to, interestingly, an institutional change just a few years ago with the census allowing people in the census to check more than one box. And so people's self-identities are sort of shifting in response to that as they are being given the option to take on a more complicated racial identity.
Yeah, somebody could check multiple boxes. I can appreciate that as a complication. Something else we consistently hear now is not everybody's going to high school. I can't tell you how many of our clients or partners have said it's harder to get students to come because they question the value of the education, and they go, hey, why would I pay for a 4-year degree when Amazon's going to hire me at $25 an hour right now? Could we break this down a little bit further? The differences maybe between that 2-year and the traditionals, or let's push this a little bit further.
Sure. So, the WICHE has focused on high school graduates, and for good reason. I think a lot of people have a lot of reason to be interested in the number of high school graduates. For instance, we've seen increased retention rates in high school, and that's wonderful news. And but at the same time, when we in higher ed receive the WICHE data, there is a little bit of a slippage there with the same high school numbers being offered to 2-year institutions as selective 4-year institutions, and yet we can understand that those are different markets. And so my own work tried to use data that we saw, longitudinal data from the Department of Education, that looked at the probability of college going, and in particular, where did young people go to college, to try to differentiate what might the market for a 2-year institution versus a highly selective 4-year institution versus a 4-year institution that's not highly selective. How might those markets look? So in this slide, we've got 4 different submarkets. In the upper left, we have 2-year institutions. So we're looking at the number of young people with demographic markers that suggest in the recent past, this kind of student would be likely to attend a 2-year institution. Then in the upper right-hand panel, we have same concept. It's how many young people have demographic markers that have been associated with attending 4-year institutions not among the top 100 colleges or universities. So they have a very regional recruitment base. The bottom 2 panels are similar concepts. In the bottom left, we have 4-year institutions ranked 51 to 100 on US News's list. And then finally, in the bottom right, we have young people with demographic markers associated with attending the top 50 colleges or universities. Everything is presented here relative to 2018. So if you see 90%, that means we're 10% off of the 2018 level. And so as you look at these 4 different submarkets and their projections, we see some things that are in common. One is all of them have this pullback after 2025, and that's just the echo of the birth dearth, that we saw a decline in number of babies born, and so we have a decline in number of people going to college. We also see a commonality of these regional differences. The Midwest and the Northeast, we saw this again in the WICHE data with the high school graduates. This is just echoing 2 factors primarily. The low fertility in that region and the outmigration of young people makes those markets tougher than the South and the West. But as we look across the 4 panels, I think you can see that when we get to more selective forms of higher ed, there's sort of an upward trend, and it's against this upward trend that we have a contraction, versus in the more open access institutions in the top 2 panels, we have sort of a plateau and then decline. So why is there a difference in kind of that trend? That speaks to another compositional change that we haven't talked about. We're seeing an increased share of parents who have college degrees, and those parents are more likely to send their kids to college, to 4-year college, and to selective 4-year colleges. And so it creates this situation where in the next 15 to 20 years, I think we're going to see generally strong to rising pools for the most selective institutions, unless something changes. We can talk about some things that could change. While at the same time, we have generally a contraction in the number of young people. And so we've got a little bit of, a tale of 2 different paths ahead, with some institutions experiencing a relatively easy path and other institutions a slightly more challenging path. We can also think about who's in these different markets, thinking about subgroups of people. So here we're looking at race ethnicity distributions. In the left 2 most bars, we've just got the distribution of 18-year-olds. The first bar is for a not too distant past of 2018 and 2019, and the second bar is for a not too distant future of 2033 and 2034. And so we can see in those left two most bars, the story I know everybody online has seen in many different contexts. It's the black share is shrinking, black share among 18-year-olds. So that's the non-Hispanic white share is shrinking and falling below 50%, importantly, during this time period. And largely that's accounted for by an expanding yellow share here. That's the share of Hispanic Americans. So this is a story you see on the news, that we have, this diversification of America that's driven largely by an expanding share of Hispanic Americans, and we've got a shrinking share of Black and white non-Hispanic Americans. As you look more to the right, you're seeing the same kinds of projections, but now we're looking down at the makeup of those young people with demographic markers that suggest they may go to a 2-year, a regional, a national, or an elite 4-year institution. And I think it's interesting as you look across those, the 4 sets of bars to the right of the 18-year-olds, that we see a more diverse future in every subset of higher education. Whether we're talking about a 2-year institution, the 2-year institutions, you can see they look a lot like America. This would also be true if we broke it down by parent education or income, by the way. 2-year institutions serve a remarkably representative cut of the American population. But it's also true of the 4-year institutions, whether we're talking about more open access regional institutions or the highly selective institutions, we foresee a future that is more diverse than it is today. The reasons for that rising diversity aren't always the same. So we see that the story for the 2-year institution, and for that matter, the regional 4-year institutions, is largely about an increasing share of Hispanic Americans. Whereas when we look at the more selective forms of higher ed, it's both increasing share of Hispanic and Asian Americans that accounts for the diversification. I did look at the question of what's the role of immigration here. Obviously, we're having a lot of conversations about immigration. I asked the model, what if we cut the rate of immigration in half? So a pretty substantial reduction in immigration. And you would still get this general pattern that we have more diversity in the future than we have today in every subset of higher ed. As it turns out, immigrants don't show up in the traditional age college market super frequently. A lot of them are coming after age 18, so they wouldn't show up in this market at all. And those who are coming as minors aren't typically coming at age 2. It might be more like age 15. So they might very well be important to higher ed's future, but maybe as an adult learner, or maybe even more so when they have children who become second-generation immigrants on our campuses. So the immigration story is a part of our diversification, to be sure, but it's not a huge part. Our diversification is baked into who we are as Americans. Even if we got rid of immigration entirely, I think we'd have a more diverse future than we have today. And I think that's worth acknowledging. It's also interesting to note that if you break this down by region of the country, it's also true by region. In fact, in my neck of the woods in the upper Midwest, where we are less diverse, we expect more diversification than, say, in the Pacific West, say California, where they are already so diverse, it's hard to imagine that they will see a smaller share of non-Hispanic whites, though they will. So there's going to be a little bit of catch-up, where regions of the country that are less diverse today will see a faster rate of diversification going forward.
Wow. All right. So I've already picked up that less students to go, creating more competition for us. And we have to be thinking about who we're speaking to in a different way, in a different tone, because they're going to receive us differently now. And we need to appeal to that as well. Let's go a little bit further and keep talking about matriculation rates. So let's push a little bit about what are their thoughts around, is it worth it? And how are they feeling about actually, how do we get them there, right? Even if we can attract them in this more competitive environment and speak to them, how do we get them to enroll?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is worth noting this difference. So far we've just been talking about the demographics and the makeup of the population. But obviously the propensity to attend college can and has changed over time. Unfortunately, we've recently seen some weakening in the connection between the population and higher ed. So here we're seeing some poll numbers from Gallup looking at the confidence in U.S. higher education. And we can see that in the last decade or so, there's really been a weakening in the confidence in higher ed. I think people reasonably look at this kind of data and think, okay, so there's a partisan element of this, and there is. Republicans are more likely to express doubt about their confidence in higher ed, but I think it's worth noting that we've seen erosion in independents and Democrats as well. There seems to be something more broadly going on. Certainly there's a partisan political element. We can see it in sort of the debates that we have going on. So on the left here, the case against higher education by Brian Kaplan. This might feel more like it's coming from the political right. I think it's interesting, the title of this book, because what's inside this book is not really the case against education. It's an argument about labor economics and where do we get returns to education. Kaplan arguing that there's more sheepskin effect, that it's more about signaling rather than actual learning things and acquiring human capital. But he still argues that there's a big return to getting your degree. And yet the title was The Case Against Education. I think that speaks to the moment that we're in, that would be a title that an editor thought would make sales. On the right, we see calls for free education and elimination of debt. And it's certainly possible to call for free college for all or the forgiveness of all student loans without questioning the value of higher ed. But it does give me pause, because I don't think there are very many high quality, valuable products out there that I expect to get for free. And on the debt forgiveness side, we've traditionally understood debt forgiveness as a reasonable response to fraud. So when people say, hey, we should just have blatant forgiveness of all debt, it strikes me that there may be some real questions about whether people feel that what higher ed is providing to students is, a quality product. When we look at polling data, a lot of people do express questions about that. Democrats are more likely to say that they have concerns about the high cost of higher ed than Republicans. The Republicans share some concerns about cost. Both Republicans and Democrats say they're not sure that young people are getting the skills that they need out of higher ed to prepare them for the job market. So there's a lot of question about whether it's worth it for higher ed. And as a consequence, we can see that people are less interested in showing up to higher ed. So here we've got total fall enrollments. You can see that there definitely was a COVID impact there in 2020 and the years that followed. But I think it's worth noting that the total fall enrollment started falling long before then. This was concentrated in the 2-year sector, but if we look in the 4-year sectors, we certainly have seen a leveling off in enrollments in recent years. We've seen matriculation rates on average go from the upper 60s to the lower 60s, maybe a 10% decline in the matriculation rate, suggesting that some of these questions about the value of higher ed are showing up in people's willingness to attend college. Now, some of this might be, as you pointed out, Drew, that there are some interesting job opportunities that don't require higher ed. We've seen from 2012 roughly until 2023 or 24, we saw wage growth faster at the bottom of the wage distribution than the top. So we were having wage compression. This is a massive reversal of what we'd seen from 1973 until roughly 2012, when we talked a lot about increasing inequality. I think the conversation about increasing inequality persisted, even though the data were actually reversing. But when we think about that from higher ed's perspective, if high-end jobs are not seeing the same kind of wage growth that low-end jobs are, when you're that student who's on the margin between, do I go to college, maybe disproportionately a 2-year college, or do I just go to the job sector? And you can see that you can get $22 an hour working at Aldi. It starts to be kind of interesting question, like, is this worth going to college, or should I just go into the job market? We're seeing this increased competition already show up in whether we're talking about 2-year, public 4-year, private 4-year, in terms of the fees. Again, we have a story that people talk about, the unconscionable increases in tuition, and you can see here from the data from the College Board that we've actually seen the fees in decline in real terms for a number of years now. And if we look at net fee income, so once we adjust for the aid that the students are given, we've been in net decline for a long time now. And I think many of our institutions are feeling that. We might be able to recruit students, but we're doing so only by discounting at heavier and heavier rates. And as a consequence, our total net revenues aren't necessarily keeping pace. So we've got some evidence that people's attitudes toward higher education are shifting in ways that are leading to decreases in the matriculation rate. And this is, before we even get into the demographic decline that we're about to experience, and that's having an effect on the bottom line of institutions as net fee incomes decline.
Yeah, I wish we could publish this slide on a billboard somewhere and say it's not,
Yeah.
it's actually getting a little bit better,
Right.
which is great. But I've heard a lot of challenges, right? We've heard about the less number of students, the changing demographics of students, and now the questioning of it. It feels like there's a lot of bad. What perspective should college universities take to these? Are these just inevitable and external, or do we as institutions still retain some agency and control over this?
Yeah, so we will again talk about this in much more detail in session 2, but I do want to have this teaser just because I don't want to leave it as, oh, okay, so maybe get our CVs ready and find a different job. That's not a very constructive attitude. I will say that we have to be a little bit honest about the math. So when we think about how many students show up to campus, it's really the product of a population number, the high school graduation rate, and then the matriculation rate among those who graduate from high school. So you just multiply those together and you get your enrollment number. What we're seeing is the population of young people declining. And so we might think, well, why don't we just recruit harder? And I'm going to argue next time that recruiting harder may well be something that we want to do, and we can talk about how and where that might occur. But we have to be a little bit realistic here when we say, can we just recruit our way out of this entirely? How high would the matriculation rate have to go to offset a decline in the number of young people being born that has now reached about 17%? And if the current matriculation rate is 62% of high school graduates going on to post-secondary education, we could offset that contraction in the population if we got the matriculation rate up to 75%. But that kind of increase in the matriculation rate is not something we've seen in the past. And it seems to me that we need to kind of be honest with ourselves that, okay, collectively, that's not likely to happen. Some institutions may recruit their way out of this, but we are not going to collectively maintain enrollments just by recruiting more students in through the front door. Though if we could address part of the problem by increasing access, that would be great. We're going to have to look for some other solutions. Some other ways we might want to look is, can we retain students more effectively so that despite the fact that the number of young people coming in through the front door is declining somewhat, the total number of students on campus remains the same because we get multiple year customers. We have those first year students retained from one year to the next. And I think this is a really auspicious place to look, in part because higher ed has not done particularly well in this area. Depending on how you measure the student attrition rates in the 2-year and the 4-year sector, it might be something like 3/4 of students who attend an institution for the first time in one fall stick around 1 year later. And I just think about, like, when I'm buying a car, if I go to the auto dealer and the auto dealer told me this is a great car, people love this car. In fact, lots of people who bought this car last year are still driving the car this year, and 3 out of 4 people are still driving it this year. I would say that's crazy. I mean, this is way too expensive a product for me to go on the odds of only 3 out of 4 chance that I'm going to still be here. And yet that's kind of what we're doing in higher ed.
Wow.
That failure rate of the 25% attrition actually it's a little bit of a silver lining in this whole challenge, because if we can retain more students, then we don't have to recruit more students. And we are seeing, whether we're talking about the 2-year sector and the ASAP program that's been so effective, or we're talking about the 4-year sector like the University of Southern Maine that's focused on advising, or Rutgers that has worked on making student work a point of contact for mentorship, or the Male Success Alliance at CSU Dominguez Hills trying to work on this greater sense of belonging, or we see things like the ASAP program focusing on academic support or financial aid support. All of these attempts to improve retention rates are a way that we might be able to maintain enrollments despite having fewer students walk through the front door.
Yeah, what a great reminder too that enrollment management is not just about bringing in new students. It's about keeping the ones we have and completing the ones that are here.
Exactly. And I think, here as a faculty member, I feel a little guilty because I recognize that the enrollment management office usually sits, in a different division from the faculty. And there's kind of this sense that, oh, enrollment management, that's somebody else's problem. But it really can't be somebody else's problem. Students are in my classroom 3 times a week. I am often the most consistent touch point for that student as they make that decision of, is this place for me? Or, I've been thinking maybe it's time for me to go. And so we really need to build some relationships between the enrollment management function enrollment management folks who might have, for instance, great data signaling who's at risk and so on, and faculty members and staff members who on a daily basis are interacting with those young people. I think about my roommate in college who made a great connection with the custodian in our dorm. Every faculty member and staff member who interacts with students can be that person who draws a student in. And here's just a reminder that we may have to talk about academic programming in this context, because if we want to retain more students, students are coming to our institutions because they view it as an investment in their future. And if they don't see that connection between what they're doing now and life after college, we know that they're less likely. So on the left-hand side, we see Gates Foundation research showing that students view this as a step to the future. On the right-hand side, we've got Gallup and Strata data showing that when students see a connection between what they're doing in the classroom and life after college, they're much more likely to agree that they're learning important skills. That this is a high-quality education and that the investment was worth it. And so if we're going to try to increase retention, we might have to talk about what's going on in the classroom and how can we I'm not talking about turning every program into a pre-professional program. I'm in a liberal arts college, and that's just never going to fly here, and it shouldn't. But I am talking about how we help students see the connections between what they're learning and what they're going to be doing later. And we might be looking for collaboration. It's going to be a highly competitive market that we're in, and we don't want to lose sight of the fact that some of our regionally located near peers might be useful to us. So just, one example of that, DePauw University, SMWC, which is St. Mary's of the Woods College, and Rose-Hulman are all co-located pretty closely. They're small, so they recognized that they had some mental health challenges that required a program that was bigger than any one of them could provide. But they found that by working together, they could jointly hire and create a program that was more robust and serve all of their campuses better. I think this is a really clever out-of-the-box way to think. How can we work with some institutions who we might be competing with on Monday, but on Tuesday, let's talk together about how we might improve retention together or improve the product of what we're offering. So, sometimes we're going to work alone and sometimes we're going to work together. So as we think about making this turn between session 1, which is really about the challenges we face, towards session 2, what I'm going to argue is, I hope positively, rather than thinking about this as something that's happening to us, let's see if we can retain that sense of agency. In Talib's book, Anti-Fragile, Nassim Talib points out that there are 3 responses to stress. The first is to break, and we know that fragility is bad. So we run away from fragility. Sometimes we run too quickly toward robustness or resiliency. The resilient or the robust simply resists the shock and stays the same. Think of it like a turtle that just pulls into its shell and lets the stress wash over it, with the whole goal being, can I come out the other side unchanged? And admittedly, for some of our institutions, that will be an auspicious goal. An aspirational goal. Can we get through this unchanged? There are some institutions that are really going to be in the pressure cooker here. So I don't mean to denigrate the outcome of resiliency. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for. But I think there are going to be a number of institutions that can hope for anti-fragility. This notion that when put under stress, we become stronger versions of ourselves. As we'll talk about in greater detail in session 2, can we expand access? Can we make clearer connections between the academy and student lives after college? Can we improve retention rates and persistence and student success rates so that we better fulfill our missions? So that maybe in the year 2045 or 2050, whenever we get to kind of the bottom of this birth dearth, going through higher ed, and we've gotten through the transition, I'm not anticipating that we're going to look back and say, wow, that was easy time in enrollment management. But instead, might we look back and say, wow, that was rewarding. We are stronger versions of ourselves. And while I wouldn't necessarily wish to go through it again, we put the experience to good use. And that's kind of my hope for all of us. And I'm excited for the questions that follow.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why my title, in addition to co-founder here, says Recovering Senior VP of Enrollment Management, because I don't know that I'll ever fully recover from the time that I spent in that chair. And I know a lot of my colleagues will always feel like there's always something more we could or should be trying to do. And we all do it because we love the job, not because obviously the money. So a couple questions. Right. Thank you for those of you who are sending them in. I will read them as they have come in. We did have a few submitted in advance, but I will not change any words because I don't want to change any interpretation. So one that came in prior to, In your updated edition, has Nathan found that some of his earlier assumptions turned out to be different? What does he think may have caused any differences in college going rates, college migration destinations, etc.?
Yeah, great question. So first, yeah, in the second book, The Agile College, chapter 2 kind of goes through the update of the projections. And I do note there that the projections for the end year, 2029, in the first book, seem to be reflecting something strange in the data from the year of the American Community Survey that was used, so that they're overly negative. That said, when you do the update, you get to the same low point. It just takes you a couple extra years to get there. So maybe we have a little bit more time before we hit those lows. There were changes in college going rates between the original version and the update. So for instance, Hispanics attended college at a slightly higher rate. It doesn't really, I mean, those things are good as outcomes just of themselves, but recognize that if we have a higher, say, Hispanic or some other subgroup college going rate as we get to this year, it doesn't really help us with what happens between now and say 2042, because we still have the contraction going on. If we had a higher college going rate, it just raises the level of our enrollment as we start, but then we track the same demographic patterns going forward unless something else changes. So if college going rates are going to solve this for us, what we need is like incrementally higher college going rates over and over and over and over for the next 15 to 20 years. So it's, you know, we still have the work to do ahead of us, in other words, to deal with the demographic change that's coming ahead. Now, to some degree, what we've actually seen is a decline in college going rates since about 2018. That makes it slightly more believable that we might increase college going rates, because you saw, like, look, it wasn't that long ago that we had 66 or 67% of students rather than 61% attending college. So why can't we just get back to where we were in 2018? And that would do a lot to offset the declining size of the pool. So I can understand that argument that, hey, look, you know, the fact that we've given up some ground recently suggests that we can regain that ground. On the other hand, you could make a counter argument that the trend recently has been negative. Why would we think that it won't continue to be negative? In which case we have falling matriculation rates while we have a contracting pool size, which makes the projections that I printed a rosy picture compared to what will really happen. So, you know, the bottom line is we've got our work cut out for us if matriculation rates are going to help us out.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's why so many of our partner institutions turn towards that non-traditional market now, right? Of these
Absolutely.
now, I've heard the numbers 41.5 million people that have started some college but have no credential, right? So
yeah, or another figure, something like 100 or 110 million workers between the ages of 25 and 54. Whether they have a degree or not, every one of these might be interested in upskilling for a new job or for a promotion. And when you think about how small the penetration would have to be into a market of 110 million, there are about 3.5 to 4 million kids per birth cohort, depending on which year you're looking at here. So, you know, a 1% increased penetration into that adult learner market, that would be 1 million kids. That would swamp the decline in births that we're talking about. So you can see why that focus becomes interesting.
100%. Well, while we're in that vein, I'll caveat to this. We keep hearing about AI everywhere. Do you have any thoughts around how AI will affect all this retooling, or any thoughts around AI in general?
I think AI is going to affect the way we do our work. I was just in a conversation yesterday talking about how our thinking about quantitative reasoning curricula is probably going to shift. We now have kind of a model where there are multiple tracks, where there's sort of a college algebra course that's viewed as, you know, what if you aren't going for a sciences track? But the problem with that curriculum is AI can do those kinds of problems easily now. So why does it matter whether I learn how to do that? And instead, don't we need a course that focuses on how we use data in the context of arguments, whether that's formal statistics or something else? So I think we can see there that AI might be rewriting the curriculum of what some math tracks or pathways look like, because AI simply says, why would you want to learn college algebra if that's your end point, if that's your last math class? You don't really need to learn this. The tool can do it for you. So I think we're going to see curriculum changes that way. I also think we're going to start to see some employers and some employees wondering whether it makes sense to do that upskilling by going back to a post-secondary institution. Yes, I want to upskill, but can't I just, for free, interact with an AI tutor and learn how to code and learn to do whatever it is I need to do next? I'm a little bit skeptical that AI can do everything that people promise. I read a lot of people saying, well, you can ask the AI to do this and you can ask it to do that. And often I notice, but you didn't show me that it actually could do that well. You just said I could ask. Well, I can ask anything. So I think there's still definitely going to be a role for higher ed, but I think we need to think about what is it that is our comparative advantage? What is it, in that reasoning skill? Apparently, it's not generating large masses of text, which people used to be impressed by the fact that I could crank out paragraphs at a time. Nobody's impressed by that anymore. Everybody can do that. Now, if you're going to make your mark, it's because your students are going to be able to reason and think and put ideas together in novel ways, which isn't really what the LLMs are designed to do.
Yeah. Well, our group is getting warmed up here. So here's another one. Several states have passed legislation offering 2 years of free community college for state residents. How do you expect these relatively new zero-cost options to impact the enrollment forecast you're discussing here?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to massively shift it in most states because most states already have net fees for two-year institutions that are quite low. In some places, it is, on average, it's negative. So that said, there are some states like Vermont that still have very high fees for two-year institutions. And so in that context, it could make a difference. Certainly when we see innovations in policy like that, we would expect that there's going to be a draw out of the four-year sector and into the two-year sector. What happens then in the four-year sector is not only going to be affected by the starting point where some people on the margin are drawn into the two-year sector at the start, but also then we're going to see some concerns that the two-year colleges do a good job then of the baton passing, because if this student would have started a four-year school, it would be a real shame if they went to the two-year institution and then didn't manage to make the transfer back to the four-year institution, which was their ultimate goal. So I think those kinds of policy changes absolutely could cause changes in the projections because it's going to change where people go. And my concerns are that we have to do it in a high quality way so that we get the if what it does is to draw more students into the system because of the clarity of the $0 price tag, that could be a positive. But if what it does is divert students away from their intended paths and they don't manage to get back on there and there's not a whole lot of new students entering the system, it could actually be a negative.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another one. We have a lot of programs focused on first generation students. In your data, can you predict when first generation will become second generation? In other words, do you see a time that most parents have at least some college, and this may be regional?
Yeah, actually, during this time period, the models suggest that we will cross that tipping point, and we'll actually see a decline in the number of first-gen students. Now, when I think about what that means for institutions, I'm less clear. Right now, we think of first gen as a really useful flag when, as an academic advisor, I see that a student is first gen. I have kind of a picture of the institutional needs that they might need because they don't have the social capital at home. As we go into the future, we might see more students who have parents who have college degrees, but of course, a lot of that expansion and access has been done in ways that don't look like the traditional four-year college path. So my parents both went to college, and if you all have a picture now of a residential four-year experience, you're right. But when we think about my students who say, oh yeah, I've got my mom's got a college degree, increasingly that story might look like she started at a two-year college, then she stopped out for a while, then she went back, and then she changed institutions to another two-year school before then transferring for a four-year institution. She did some part-time work there, then she took some time off, and then she completed her degree online. Okay, that student, just because they aren't first gen, may still need all of the supports that we have offered first gen students in the past. And instead, we might be heading toward a future where our signals are getting muddied because I, as an advisor, see, oh yeah, this kid's got a parent who's got a college degree, and I falsely assume that they understand the Byzantine systems of higher ed, when in fact that student still needs every bit as much support. So instead, in the future, we might need to be having more detailed conversations with students about, okay, so what is your family connection to higher ed? Are you feeling comfortable in this space, or are you feeling like you're a fish out of water, and you know, you need the additional guidance that we currently give first-gen students. So I do anticipate that we'll see slightly fewer first-gen students by the 2040s, just because the access agenda is making progress. But I think it just complexifies the work that we currently do under the banner of first-gen support.
Yeah, I think that even that definition of, I remember what traditional transfer student meant to now,
Right.
like you can easily have an 18-year-old that really is more of an adult learner focus than your traditional age student, depending on their
Absolutely.
lifestyle. So, okay.
Yep.
Here's another one. With the emerging popularity of 3-year bachelor's degrees, how do we see this trend impacting the reporting categories of 2 versus 4-year institutions? For instance, some 2-year degree granting institutions are beginning to offer 3-year applied bachelor's degrees, while there are also traditionally 4-year degree granting institutions beginning to offer a 3-year bachelor's degree. Should we be tracking these degrees in a separate new category?
Oof. I would say as a researcher, yes.
Yeah.
Right? We always want more insight into that. You know, in this space, I think it underscores the increased competition that we're in. We're seeing 2-year institutions recognizing apparently the value of competing with the 4-year institutions for the bachelor's degree. We're also seeing, by the way, 4-year institutions adding associate's degrees and, you know, going the opposite direction in terms of competition. And so I think it does speak to the highly competitive environment that we're in. You know, while competition can have some downsides, one of the upsides of this is that we just have more educational diversity for our students. Our students have really disparate goals and wants and paths that might make sense for them. And so one of the things that I always feel bad about when I see institutions closing is just the reality that there isn't a perfect substitute for any of these institutions that have closed their doors. And that means there are students out there for whom this would have been the best match, and that best match no longer exists. And so when we see more flexibility in degree offering, it can be a bonus to our students who, you know, they might be at a 2-year institution, but we know that the majority of students starting at a 2-year institution aspire eventually to get a bachelor's degree. So, you know, finding ways to get them to where they're trying to go is the ultimate goal of higher ed sector. And so I think, you know, it probably would be best reporting wise if we were better able to see into these differences. There are lots of places where we have sort of crudeness in the data. You know, another example of this would be by race and ethnicity. You know, this person's Asian. Oh, what in the world does that mean? Now, in that case, we have a smaller subpopulation, and so it might not be possible to disaggregate. You know, in Minnesota, for instance, we have a Hmong population, and they're completely distinguishable in all sorts of cultural attitudes from, say, Korean or Chinese or Japanese Americans, but they all get lumped into the same, you know, the same bin.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. For those of you, I will not get to all the questions, and that's okay. We'll try to do some of this, and we'll take them all down, and we'll get you answers afterward, and we'll send those out. But I'll end on this one, and it's just because we've heard this from everybody. Dual enrollment programs, high school, college simultaneously, are becoming far more popular. Parents and students love the affordability. Do you have insights on how dual enrollment may be affecting this perceived worth of higher education?
Yeah, I think it's really, there's another place where measurement is such an interesting question. It's really hard to say just how much dual enrollment has exploded because we've changed the definitions over time and so on, but it's pretty clear that it is increasing pretty rapidly. It presents some real challenges budgetarily, depending on the state you're in, the consequences to the high school and to the 2-year institution or the 4-year institution that's hosting the dual enrollee can be very, very different. I think, you know, I think it does show that we have an opening in that families are viewing it as worthwhile to get the dual enrollment, so they prefer this to whatever's being offered at the high school.
Mm-hmm.
The downside is it does mean students are coming with more often cheaply acquired credits, meaning that they might only have to be at, say, a 4-year institution for 3 years in order to graduate. And I hear from some 4-year institutions in that situation that, you know, we're hardly getting compensated at all from the state while they were a high schooler. And then we only get them for 3 years instead of 4 in the ideal case that they come to us. And all too often they aren't coming to us. It's just, you know, we were required by the state to teach them at a relatively low compensation, and then they go off and they go to a different institution entirely. So I think there's, as dual enrollment becomes more popular, we're going to have a lot of states that should take a closer look at how they're funding it to make sure that it makes sense for all the institutions that are involved.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well, let's wrap up. Dr. Grawe, thank you again so much for this, and we look forward to your insights when we do this again later this year. For everyone on the call, thank you for spending this hour with us. We hope you felt it was an hour well spent. I certainly did. We will be sending the recording out to everyone, so you have it for your records. I'll also make sure we send out the Q&A and get answers to these questions for you. And then finally, we'd love to continue to have these conversations. If you are ever wondering if your institution is transfer friendly, quote unquote, I would love to have one of our senior consultants do a free transfer friendliness assessment. All I need from you is your institution and your top 3 cross-app competitors, and we can show you some pretty cool stuff of how we would do that. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you again, Dr. Grawe, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon and evening.